Reif was born in Vienna in 1927. Here he begins his story with a few recollections from his early life. Then he recounts his experiences in the fateful year of 1938, when Germany annexed Austria and Fred was 11 years old. His life then changed dramatically, with some tragic consequences.
Austria today is a rather small country in the middle of Europe, and here it is, you see? Here's Vienna. Well, before World War I, before 1914, Austria was a great empire, which included in it also part of Poland. And my father was in fact born in that part of Poland, and in the First World War he fought in the Austrian army. He was then became a prisoner of war in Russia, and after the war he returned to Vienna, went to medical school, became a dentist, and settled himself professionally in Vienna. Also during this time he met my mother, whom he married, in 1927, which is about 9 years after the end of World War I. Now, the beginning of my life was fairly uneventful. I don't remember nothing but snippets from it. But at age 6 or so, I entered school. I liked school quite a bit. I was a good student, except in one case, physical education. Oh, I hated it. And I was abysmal at it, okay? But anyhow, otherwise I was fine. And then I should also say that, Austria is a strongly Catholic country, and as a Jew I felt myself in a minority. But all during my childhood I never felt any anti-Semitism. I myself never did. Now, what happened next, that when I turned 7 or so, my sister was born. So I had a young sister at that point. And then when I turned 10, I went to a different school, because the German and European education is rather peculiar. Namely, they ask students to decide at age 10 what they ultimately want to do. If they ultimately want to go into a trade or something like that, they continue 4 years of high school after age 10 and then get out. If, on the other hand, they want to go into a profession and go to university, they go to a special, what they call a gymnasium, which means an academic high school, which lasts for 8 years. And so by the time they come out at age 18, they go directly to university. Okay? So when I became 10, I passed an exam and, in fact, went to an academic high school in Vienna, which was a more interesting place than the original school. And except for that, things were fairly uneventful. We often spent vacations or summers in the mountains, in the Alps. And so my father was quite busy in his practice as a dentist. But one thing, despite the seeming calm, people were nervous. Why were they nervous? Because, first of all, it was a time of depression, in the 1930s. Secondly, one by one, the various democracies in Europe fell by the wayside to be replaced by dictatorships. In 1933, in Germany, Hitler came to power. Around the same time in Italy, Mussolini came to power and again started a war in Abyssinia, which is now Ethiopia. Around the same time, there was a civil war going on in Spain. Franco was trying to overthrow the socialist government. Even in Austria, things were not all that calm. There was a revolution back around 1934, and I remember that people shooting back and forth in the street along which I lived, because I lived in the main street in Vienna, which led directly across a bridge going around the Danube. And therefore, this being a fairly important street, when a revolution comes, that's a perfect place to want a set of guns and shoot across the river. So except for things like that, things are fairly peaceful. Now, in 1938, I was 11 years old. How old are most of you by this time? 14? All right? Okay. So anyhow, I was younger than you are now, okay? I was 11. And there was a certain, I remember going out and taking a walk in the afternoon with mother, and there was a kind of nervousness in the streets. And then in the evening, as I was home, there were crowds of people marching down the street underneath, and they were chanting Juden verecke im eigenem Drecke, which translated means Jews perish in your own filth. Not a very friendly thing to chant. And the next day, which was a Saturday, we could notice there's German soldiers in the streets, and day later, on Sunday, Hitler officially announced that henceforth Austria was a part of Germany, and that was it. So almost overnight, Austria had become a part of Germany. Now, difficulties with being Jewish started almost immediately. First of all, let me explain that in addition to the army which Germany had, there were two kind of private armies, so armies which essentially belonged to the Nazi party rather than to the state. And one of them were the so-called brown shirts, sometimes called SA, and the others were the black shirts, sometimes called SS. Now the black shirts, SS, were a kind of elite military group. The SA was a group of bullies, and they are essentially specialized in being bullies. And so after the march into Austria, almost immediately things started. The windows of Jewish stores were vandalized, or had graffiti on them, or sometimes were broken. That was a very favorite pastime. Another pastime which they had was a very interesting one. They would essentially wait for people like Jews to walk down the street, grab them, and then give them the bucket and the brush and force them on the hands and knees, scrub the sidewalk. Well, they would stand around in a circle, jeering and making fun of them. So we learned quickly one should not try to be very visible when one walks the sidewalk, but kind of walk in a fashion where you'd not be easily seen. Another thing which happened fairly rapidly is, in park, benches were marked as not for Jews. We're not supposed to sit there. In addition to all this kind of organized stuff, there was less organized stuff because, when basically the authorities essentially now go in for Jew bashing, various other elements of the population think it's a great sport and started to do likewise. So, for example, just about a week after the Germans walked in, a couple of people entered the apartment of the person who lived in the floor beneath us, asked for money, and when the guy did not fully satisfy them, they shot him. And the guy managed to after that, run up a flight of stairs, collapse in our foyer in our apartment. I presume he ran up there because he knew my father was a doctor, might be able to provide first aid. He survived, actually. But anyhow, an example of what happened. Well, after a while, things became officially more difficult. One thing was I was informed that henceforth Jews were no longer allowed to go to the academic high schools. Now there was one academic high school which was all Jewish in Vienna. So anyhow, if they wanted to transfer to this one and could get in there, that's fine. That high school accommodated about 450 students, a very small fraction of the students in all the academic high schools in Vienna. And so I had to switch school and go to this particular Jewish high school. Another thing which was more serious, my father was essentially henceforth forbidden to continue his practice. Being a Jew is not allowed to practice dentistry anymore, period. That's it. Now it became clear to all of us that this was an untenable situation. It was only going to get worse. And therefore the thing to do was to see, could one possibly get out of Austria? The trouble was, where do you go? Just get in. Now the one place which one thought one might have a chance to get in was the United States. In fact, my father had a sister who lived in New York. But the trouble with the United States was the United States was very closely limiting immigration. And they had a quota system. which went according to place of birth of the person. And so my parents, having been born in Poland, they were on a Polish quota, and that was a very bad quota to be on, because it would take at least 2 or 3 years even to come up. And who can wait 2 or 3 years in those circumstances? So there really was no place to go. Well, my father became extremely depressed. And basically, he had lost his practice. Jews were being persecuted all around. Various people among acquaintances were being carted off to concentration camps. And there was no place to go. So he felt very much like a trapped animal. And he became very depressed. He would just almost not say a word. He would often, in the evening, stand near the window, look out the window for hours on end, not say a word. Sometimes I would just go and be with him, just to hold his hand and somehow assure him that I was still with him. And so one day he had gone out with my mother, and by noontime he was supposed to be back. He wasn't back. And 1 o'clock arrived and 2 o'clock arrived and he still wasn't back, and we got worried what happened to him. And then there was a phone call telling us that he'd been found. He had jumped off a building and killed himself. Well, needless to say, I could feel that loss quite severely. So that happened in September, just about 6 months after the Germans had marched in. So what that left behind then was essentially me, my mother, and my sister, who at that time was about 4 years old. I
was about 4-ish when my father departed the scene. And I have pictures of him sort of leaning over me in my stroller, and I don't know, picnics and stuff like that.
And the next thing which I remember vividly was a few weeks later, maybe 5 weeks later or so, I was in school in the morning when all of a sudden a teacher opened the door and rushed in and said, "You people, all you students, just go home as directly as possible. Just go home, go home." We didn't quite know what was going on, so anyway, but I went. And then when I once got on the street, I was realizing what's going on. It was obviously an organized onslaught on Jews, because there were people running around the street, breaking windows and stuff like this. But people on our street dragging behind them Torahs. What a Torah is the Jewish scriptures, which obviously had stolen from various synagogues and whatnot. So there was a big ado, a big Jewish hunt going on that day. So I made it home and stayed home and kind of just waited and see what else was going to happen. And nothing really happened until the evening. In the evening, after night fell, there was a knock on the door. Open up. There were 3 people outside the door, one of them being the superintendent of our building. And they came in waving a pistol and made all kind of nasty remarks and started going through the house, looking through all the cabinets and drawers, taking whatever they wanted, and finally mercifully leaving. Anyhow, what I'm describing now has come known since the time as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, because it was a organized attempt to persecute Jews on that particular day.
Kristallnacht was the name given to an organized and violent pogrom against the Jewish communities of Germany, the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, and Austria. It has been estimated that over the 2-day period, 91 Jews were killed, 30,000 Jewish men and boys were arrested and sent to concentration camps, 267 synagogues were desecrated and destroyed, and Jewish-owned businesses were looted and destroyed. The Nazis said that this was a spontaneous reaction to Herschel Greenspann's murder of diplomat Ernst von Rath. In fact, Hitler had ordered this action, and propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels gave the order. At 11:55, Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller sent a telegram to all police units stating that actions against Jews, and especially their synagogues, will take place in all Germany. They are not to be interfered with. Firemen were sent to burning buildings, not to put out the fires, but to make sure they did not spread to other dwellings.
All of a sudden there was a crisis situation, and on the night of Kristallnacht, I was up in my mother's arms and my brother Fred was holding on to her skirt, and there was this incredibly loud knock at the door, and my mother went to open the metal thing on the peephole, and one of these Nazi guys just smashed the glass with a revolver, and the superintendent who was with these guys said, in German of course, please let us in, Mrs. Reif, we won't hurt you. And so they came and just helped themselves to whatever they wanted, and they took essentially all our valuables. And I really know that from hearing it from my mother, but the one thing that I remember is that in the cook's place in the kitchen, there was a white closet which had a triple pastille can, and she collected Austrian pennies in that. And I always had my eye on that can of pennies. And so when they took that, that's the only thing that I specifically remember them taking, and I remember to this day the feeling of anger, even as a little kid, of them taking away this thing that I really had my eye on. And so after that time, it became very clear rapidly that we had to leave.
Well, this was not the end of the year, it was now in November. And the new year came to pass, and of course the situation did not get any better, and the problem basically for us, which means my mother and myself and my sister, was really in some sense the same as before. How the hell do you get out of this place? Well, it wasn't so easy. In fact, there was no country which wanted to let you in. And waiting for the United States was just, was years away. And then we heard, in fact, it was a friend of mine, a father of a friend of mine, who essentially informed us that in fact it seemed to be possible to get and buy entrance visas to Cuba. So that basically it might be possible to get on a ship, go to Cuba, spend some months or years in Cuba, and after you've spent months time there, you might still come to the United States, but at least you get out of Austria and Germany. In fact, that person, and he was a father of a friend of mine, did in fact do that and managed to get to Cuba. And so we also persuaded my aunt in New York to buy some of these entrance visas to Cuba, which she did. And so once we obtained these visas, we said, well, now it's possible for us to leave. And so we packed up all our belongings and then bought tickets on a ship, a German ship, which was supposed to leave from Hamburg to go to Cuba. And we bought first-class tickets. Why do you think we bought first-class tickets? Because we were forbidden to take out any money from Germany. But if you can't take out any money from Germany, might as well spend it, right? So you might as well spend on first-class tickets. All right, so anyhow, the day came and we essentially had closed up the apartment and ready to leave. And so the trick now was that we had to go from Vienna to Hamburg in Germany, which means here's from Vienna, we had to go up all the way up here. This means we had to cross Germany. Well, we did that, and we did it by train, and I must say I was quite scared. And this, who wants as a Jew, wants to travel all the way through Germany? Perhaps go to a German hotel, stuff like that. So it was scary. But nothing bad really happened. And so we in fact managed to get to Hamburg. And once we got to Hamburg, we managed to get on a ship. It was on May 13th. And when the ship left Hamburg, I felt a sense of relief that somehow we had now left Germany behind us. Now the trip was a remarkable one. For me, at least, I felt it was remarkable. Because the ship contained about 900, a little bit more than 900 refugees, Jewish refugees, all of whom had somehow obtained these visas of entry into Cuba, and all of whom had now emigrated via the ship.